thank you for inviting me here. Thank you, Professor Meloni, for your kind invitation. It was a pleasure to be invited here. So, yes, indeed, I am the infrastructure manager of the Einstein Telescope research infrastructure, but today, if you allow me, I would wear a different hat. So I hold a master degree in management of research infrastructure, and also I had some training on science diplomacy. So today I would like to share some ideas and maybe questions on the role of research infrastructures within science diplomacy. And yes, I'm glad to be here also because I think I'm learning a lot from the different interventions I heard. And indeed, I must admit that when I was preparing for this panel, in the end, I came up with more questions than answers. So let's see how I can contribute to discussion. So about science diplomacy, in general, we heard from the colleague from the Commission about the conclusions of the Madrid conference in 2023. I'm not going through them again. I mean, it was very clear in his presentation. But allow me to make a step backward. That conference that was again in Madrid in 2018, and it was when the so-called Madrid Declaration was endorsed by 165 experts, including experts from my own organization, which is the National Institute for Nuclear Physics in Italy. So at that time, in 2018, many relevant experts from the Commission from all over the world actually convened in Madrid and endorsed this declaration outlining the relevance and the importance of science diplomacy towards the sustainable the development goals that were mentioned before, or towards tackling big societal challenges in general. But then I was thinking about the world in 2018, and it was a different world. If you remember, there were the FIFA World Championship in Russia. Can you imagine? It was a complete different world. It was before the pandemic. It was before a severe crisis break up, like the Syrian crisis, climate crisis, like fires and floodings, like the wars that we are seeing today. So indeed, I think in 2023, when they meet again in Madrid, they had to maybe assess the declaration against a new world, a new paradigm that emerged in very few years. So here's the first question that came to my mind. Can science diplomacy really tackle societal and global challenges? Is it really a successful instrument or mechanism or tool to further national interests in the world? There are some criticisms that have been made towards the role and the effectiveness of science diplomacy. Sometimes it is perceived or understood as being too normative, too imprecise, too idealistic sometimes, that there is an instrumentalization of science, and sometimes it's sensationalistic or too optimistic without, let's say, sound and solid grounds. So again, I ask myself question, so is it really possible to bring together science and diplomacy and to make them effectively working for the benefit of the entire population? Or maybe we are misunderstanding the difference between science diplomacy and international cooperation, because indeed in science international cooperation is something natural. I would say since the very origin of the man. I mean, scientists, academics have always traveled along the known world, and sometimes even farther, the known world, to meet their fellow colleagues. and to share knowledge, to deepen the knowledge, sometimes to escape from contexts where their knowledge was not very much understood because of their belief, their gender, or their origin. But as a matter of fact, international cooperation is embedded deeply in science. And I'm very happy of the distinction and or maybe the explanation that has been made and on the difference between religion and religion studies. I think this is at the basis also of our discussion today. So what I'm saying is that because international cooperation is embedded in science and in studies, of course the risk of misunderstanding it with science diplomacy is very high. And if I can go back to research infrastructure, we had a very interesting presentation on CESTA and SHOCK, and other research infrastructure were mentioned. Of course, if we think of the definition of research infrastructure as the backbone of science and of being the facilities that enable science at the forefront of knowledge as a facilitator of breakthrough science, it is of course again, let's say, embedded the concept of international collaboration and the role of promoting the implementation of open science policies and freedom of scientific knowledge. And I think resilience is a brilliant example of the role of research infrastructure in this context. And let me give you just a few inputs. What is the common trait among the SKA, which is the square kilometer array, the radio telescope, which is hosted as a statutory seat in the UK, but then they have the facilities spread between Australia and South Africa, the European Synchrotron Radiation Facility based in France, in Grenoble, and the adoption of open science practices and the web. They all together contributed to the response to the pandemic crisis. So even coming from very different scientific fields, when a major crisis involving all the governments in the world came, infrastructures and the science and the results and the instrument and the scientists that they were, let's say, the communities that were belonging to very different disciplines and very different research infrastructure, they've been able to join and make and work together to respond to a major crisis. So this was also, to me, very important, because we would maybe think about health research working together, but indeed there was a need of very many different scientific fields. So here comes my third question, and it's about the scientific disciplines. My answer to the very first question that was made to the panelists of this session about the role of science diplomacy as if science diplomacy is able to enhance, if science diplomacy can be enhanced by research infrastructure and science at large, my answer would be yes, of course. We have evidence of this. But to me, the very limitation of really, let's say, effective and fruitful cooperation is that sometimes science is perceived as a discipline detached from the rest of the world. So you have health, you have environment, you have economics, you have religious studies, and then you have science, as if it was a different disciplines from the others. And I think this is what really hinders the full exploitation of science diplomacy. When we think about science diplomacy, if you look at science diplomacy and research infrastructure, you will always have the same results. The role of CERN, when it was established a few years after the end of the Second World War, as an example of cooperation and let's say among countries that were actually in war just a few years before, or Sesame, the synchrotron facility in Jordan, that was the result of a European and, let's say, even global research cooperation. But I think there's more of this. And to me, the problem is not about the cooperation, which, as I said, is evident and is sound, but is about understanding the role of science not as a separate discipline, but really as an enabler of economic, societal, and technological development. A very last remark, and here I come to the conclusion of my intervention. Lastly, I have been elected as the chair of the Ethics and Member of Conduct Committee of the Gravitational Waves Scientific Cooperation, which is a cooperation made of nearly 1,700 researchers from all over the world. And in such a role, I have questions from the researchers about how they should behave when it comes to some specific topics or cooperation with some specific countries. And they say, I've received guidelines from my institute saying that I must or I must not cooperate with these countries, that I can or I cannot go to this conference in this country or cooperate with this person from this specific country. Or again, my government states that, and so on, about, let's say, limitation. So, and here my very last question about paradigm shifts, as it mentioned on the slide. What if, instead of having researchers asking questions about how they should behave on the basis of what the government say, if we have government asking how they should behave based on what scientists and research demonstrate every day with their everyday work? Thank you, that's it.